Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. If you're new around here, I'm Vivian Asimos, your resident freelance academic and pop anthropologist. And here on Scholarly Pages, the goal is to take an academic concept or book or theory and explain it in hopefully easier to understand language. The idea being that I struggled through confusion so you don't have to. So today we are talking about one of the big ones. I tried to reserve some of the kind of more cited things to kind of scatter them out, so I haven't front-loaded this. We'll do some fun stuff. I've got steampunk thing down the line, but right now we are talking about Mary Douglas, one of the big anthropologists. If you are currently taking an intro to anthropology topic, class, something like that, this name is gonna come up, and probably even this book. Natural Symbols by Mary Douglas was first published in 1970. My edition, this book, is from 2003, just for transparency's sake, and it's part of a kind of republishing of all of Mary Douglas's collective works by Routledge. Mary Douglas is an incredibly important anthropologist in the history of anthropology. She's a social, cultural anthropologist, a British social anthropologist, and she has two really big works that if you're going to be encountering Mary Douglas, it's either going to be her book Purity and Danger or her book Natural Symbols. And we'll talk about Purity and Danger at some point in the future, but I have more recently read Natural Symbols. I read Natural Symbols quite frequently. There's a lot in here that is incredibly important as well as incredibly relevant, and so we're going to talk about it. So let's start with the main point of the book. So the idea is, the kind of one of the core factors of this book is that the basic way that we live as human beings provides a system to create symbols, natural symbols that help to govern our societies. So essentially, that we have cultural and social symbols. We can think of maybe a few off the top of our heads that we can think of as symbols that represent things in a social or cultural sense. But Mary Douglas is saying we get those symbols, but there's also other symbols, more natural symbols, symbols that we might not think of as symbols, but actually are. So that's kind of quite a lot of the book, and obviously the title, Natural Symbols, the idea of these kinds of more natural symbols. I don't know how else to phrase that. Symbols that are not necessarily created or contrived in a sense of something that you might draw, like say the cross is a symbol that you would draw, but still has a lot of those kind of social, cultural elements to them. These are things that are more natural, more just present in our lives, but something that has come to be used, moved around, understood as a form of symbol. And basically part of this is that some of the ideas of discussions of society is the fact that we have a society and then our classifications, the way that we understand things and classify things and label stuff, follows the way that our society functions. But what Mary Douglas is saying is that it's a little bit of both. So our labels and categorization follows our societal structures, but also our societal understandings follow our categorizations. So they all kind of play with each other. And when we change labels and categories, it changes the social structure, and vice versa. When we change the social structure, we kind of have to change the way we classify and understand the world. So basically, our social categories, these hierarchies, these understandings that we have, they make up our society. They make up the way that our society is structured and understood. And that is reflected in the structure as well as the other classifications, and vice versa. So I'm hoping that that helps to make sense. So what Mary Douglas chooses to do is to set out to identify 4 distinctive systems of natural symbols, all of which are social systems, and in which the image of the body is used in different ways to reflect and enhance an individual's experience of society. So, basically, we are looking at the body, the way that the image of the body, the natural symbol, if you will, of the body, comes to be reflected in social systems, as well as reflected in an individual's experience and understanding of the social system. So that's the main thrust of the book. And that's obviously quite a lot. And this is one of the reasons why this book is so big and has quite a lot of discussion around it. Personally speaking, Mary Douglas kind of strides in the middle of structuralist thought and post-structuralist thought, which there was somebody that once told me that they believed that a lot of post-structuralists were just structuralist, and I may or may not agree with that. We can have a discussion about that in the comments if you want. But I think Mary Douglas definitely demonstrates how quite a lot of post-structuralist thought is also in structuralism, because she's kind of in between. If, the different strands of anthropology is relevant to you. If it's not, ignore everything that I just said. So, I'm going to focus on two of the most important topics brought up in this book, two of the kind of primary examples and discussions that she does, because these are the two things that you are going to find cited over and over and over again. If you are only going to read one chapter from this book, it's gonna be one of these two chapters, so I figured we'll focus on the stuff that you're probably going to actually be reading and hearing about. First of which is Grid Group, chapter 4. So basically the grid group thing is based off of a kind of, a grid type system, and I'll put an image of it up somewhere on the screen while I am talking about it. And basically it's defined by this idea of a spectrum of human experience that can be kind of categorized into 4 different quadrants. You've got group, which is how clearly defined an individual's social position is in a bounded social group. So basically, how clear is your social position within the hierarchy and categorizations of your society? How clearly do you understand your role within this society? And then you have grid, which is the individual's social role within the social network. So you have your social position, which is typically alongside many other people, and then your individual role within the larger social structure. So you have basically this simple grid pattern. In each category, there's kind of 4 basic ideal type kind of patterns, categories within it, each category being somewhat on a spectrum. So the group section can go from being increasingly independent of social pressures to being incredibly controlled. So again, our clearly defined social position can be highly controlled or highly independent and free-flowing. If you are, for example, talking about class, in England, that's going to be highly structured and also highly understood and laid out. And there's a lot of social pressures in relation to that discussion, as an example. But you might find that some other areas don't, and some other cultures don't have things as laid out. And this can also vary not just in big cultures, like all of the UK or something like that. It can also be really specific. So how your church group is structured can also kind of follow along the same grid group pattern, and can also be both the same and different from the wider society. And then we've got grid before we get too deep into it. Grid is from a shared classification to a private classification. So remember, the grid is the individual's social role. So this can be that your understanding of your social role is something that is inherently shared and understood and collected with everyone else, or it's something that's very private, something very individual, something very separated. So are you private and separated, or are you in the collective? So we can kind of see how this can kind of pair out. So you can say be in a highly collective kind of understanding of, say, your grid, right? So you have a shared collective understanding, you have a present place within the society, but you have a lot of outside social pressures within your role. And you can have anything of the combination of those four. It basically served as a way to classify different groups as well as individuals within that group and how they are interacting with themselves and with others and understanding their role within that social hierarchy system. One of the important things about this is that it's understanding the way that different people can have different positions even within the same society. So if we are, say, for example, talking about a church group, you can have two different people from that church that are in two different positions on this grid, and because it depends on what their role is, what their social standing is, and that can be different from an individual basis. So this isn't just a way to understand cultures, it's a way to understand societies and individuals within that society. So the focus is on the individual and the way that an individual understands or is present within their role in the society or the community group. So, next up, we're talking about the two bodies. Yes, there are two bodies that we inhabit according to Mary Douglas. One of them is the physical body, the meat stuff. I don't know why I touched my cheek to do that, but the meat stuff. And then you also have a social body. So this social body constrains and kind of dictates elements of the physical one, and vice versa. So, for example, I have a physical body that looks a certain way, but it is read socially as gendered. And I'm going to have a separate conversation about the social construction of gender in a different upcoming episode because I am planning it at the moment. But basically, this is an example of it. So the way that my physical body is constructed is socially read as female. And therefore, I then do certain things to constrain my physical body to fit that social definition that has already been placed on my physical body. Does that make sense? It's like a cyclical thing, right? So the physical body is read in a socialized way through the social body, and then that social body re-impacts on the physical body and in the way that I interact. So the fact that I wear makeup, that maybe I wear heels, that I wear certain types of outfits, these are all things that are socially read as female. These are social definitions of female, not necessarily biological ones that I am placing on my biological body in order to continue to be read as socialized female. I hope that makes sense. That's an example. And this can be a large number of different things that can be present. Things like race, things like economic status. These are all things that are the physical and the social body all interacting. And it can also be things that are a little bit less obvious than gender and race, although gender, not so obvious, but that's a discussion for another time. But it can be a lot less obvious, like, for example, what kind of clothes you wear as far as economic status is concerned, or dressing in a certain way in order to demonstrate your political ideologies. These are different things, or your religious ideologies. These are different things that are also impacting this idea. So part of this is the idea that bodily control, so the way that I control my body, also becomes a form of socialized control. So we can think about this in terms of diet culture, right? That society has determined a specific type of body to be desirable or good, right? And so then I try to constrain and put effort onto my physical, I mean, I don't, but I could theoretically be doing these things in order to have my body be controlled in a certain way to fit the socialized standard. So if I was someone who dieted, or if I was someone who exercised, one of the reasons why I might be doing these things is to fit that socialized understanding of what a good body looks like. Because different societies, different cultures, different time periods can have different ideas of what that good body looks like. And again, the style, the movement, the way we deal with our body can replicate socialized symbols. So we have a socialized symbol of what a female looks like, I am replicating that by being someone who identifies as that, and then I'm presenting my socialized body in that way. So I'm putting my physical body through certain things, putting certain stuff on it in order to represent myself to fit the social natural symbol of what woman is, right? So basically we're using our physical bodies to represent our social ones, and our social bodies are being represented by our physical. So it is kind of a cyclical thing. They both impact on each other, but the idea is that we have socialized ideas of what things look like. These are socialized symbols of what good body is, what gender is, things like that, and then we replicate them with our physical body. So we are replicating these socialized symbols. And this is also why when people go against these social symbols, when they purposefully bend these social systems, like Harry Styles wearing a dress, for example, this is purposefully representing a symbol that is typically reserved as female on a male body, one that is read as male as well as understood socially as male, and therefore it's starting to challenge these socialized symbols. And the more that people actively do things against these socialized symbols, the more that the social symbols start to change, and therefore the constraints on the physical body change. All right, let's talk about the readability and usefulness of Mary Douglas. Let's start with readability, because I always think it's important to start with readability because, not everyone is. Mary Douglas is an incredibly important anthropologist. Historically speaking, she has had a huge impact on the field of anthropology. If you are a new person coming into anthropology, whether as a student or a self-guided student, you are going to read Mary Douglas. You are going to find her cited in books. Basically, most of them that you pick up is going to cite her. Even if they're arguing against her, you have to talk about Mary Douglas. Mary Douglas is so important. However, these kinds of more historical anthropologists, well, really anthropologists in general, but particularly the historical ones like Mary Douglas, like Levi Strauss, like Clifford Geertz, which we're going to talk about all of these people eventually. They're all not the easiest to read. For Mary Douglas, she's not the worst. By far not the worst. We're going to be talking about Pierre Bourdieu's Habitus soon, or I already have. I don't know what order that I'm going to be releasing these in. And Lord, is he a struggle to read. So, she's by far not a Pierre Bourdieu. She's much easier to read than Pierre Bourdieu. However, she isn't the easiest person to read either. But I think that if you have at least a very small smidgen of experience of reading this type of work and this type of writing, if you sit down and you give yourself that little bit of extra time, I think that you'll be able to get through it fairly decently. I think that she's not the worst. I think she is very clear about what her thoughts are. She's very clear about what she thinks. And that is definitely very useful. It's just every once in a while she spends a little bit of time saying things and you might struggle with it. But she is very good at saying things multiple times. So she'll say something one way and then she'll follow it up by saying it in a slightly different way and then in a slightly different way. So hopefully one of those will be the bit that's a little bit easier to grasp, because that's kind of one of the benefits of writing in that kind of way. So if you do a little bit of a slow read, you do a slow read with a little bit of rephrasings, I don't think that this would be the worst, and I think you could probably get through it even if you don't have the greatest amount of experience with this type of writing. As far as usefulness, I'm sure you've probably gotten the gist of it by now, but she's incredibly useful. Mary Douglas in general is incredibly useful, but this book in particular, Natural Symbols, is massively useful, particularly if you're in anthropology, but really in the social sciences in general. She's cited across many of them because she's that influential, that important to the understanding of how societies are structured and understood and represented, particularly by and in individuals. The grid group and the two bodies are probably some of the most cited elements of Douglas, with potentially the only exception being the discussion of purity in Leviticus. But that's, again, a discussion for another time because that's in Purity and Danger. But with Purity and Danger, it's really one chapter that people reference a lot and the kind of general terminology that she uses. But with this book, I think the more of the book is useful rather than the terms and the ideas behind it. So all of these terms are things that you're going to run into a lot. I used a lot of grid and group when I was doing anthropology of religion. That was incredibly useful. I didn't really personally use the idea of it, but I think it underlined a lot of other approaches to the study of religion and the studies of individuals within religions. And it was also really useful in terms of just understanding how things functioned, and it was cited quite a lot. Since I have kind of become a little bit more amorphous and I'm really delving into whatever I want, since being able to leave formalized academia, I've been finding myself using the two bodies quite frequently. People have expanded on all of these ideas, not just it in general, but the grid and group people have expanded on and gotten different concepts for and expanded in their own ways. The two bodies people have expanded. Now you can read people who say there's 3 bodies, there's 5 bodies, there's 7 bodies. So if it's something that's really fascinating to you, it's a really great starting point, and then you can kind of go into this huge rabbit hole of other people using her and moving her and enveloping her and expanding her ideas in much bigger ways. So, if you like this, what else can you read? Obviously, we've got Purity and Danger by Mary Douglas. I find a lot of her theories are actually very well connected to one another, so if you find natural symbols really good, Purity and Danger is definitely a good one to do. Particularly, one of the chapters, I don't know it off the top of my head because I don't have a copy of it, but there's a chapter on the Leviticus food rules, and that one is particularly interesting and very often cited. And that one talks a lot about purity in relation to the food rules in Leviticus, particularly in regards to the pig. Mary Douglas is also a follower of Emile Durkheim, who's another sociologist, and I think that if you are interested in some of the concepts that Mary Douglas is talking about, Emile Durkheim is definitely a really good next read, because there's going to be similarities and obviously differences, but it's at least going to be on a similar track. And again, Emile Durkheim will probably come up at some point in this if you want to wait around, or you could go ahead and forge on your own towards Durkheim. And as I mentioned, she sometimes dabbles with structural anthropology, and this is where you can pick up some Claude Levi-Strauss. I am a particular fan of Claude Levi-Strauss, so we're probably going to cover him at some point soon. But those are some of the kind of bigger names that would be around Mary Douglas. There's obviously going to be all sorts of other books on her, and in the case of most of these really big influential anthropologists like Mary Douglas, you're probably going to find books that people have written synthesizing her work and her ideas. So if you want to go out and find some of those, you might find somebody writing about it in slightly different language if you want to hear someone else's opinions on it, and they'll also provide pros and cons and ideas and all of that kind of stuff. So any of those would also be a really great place to go. And that's it for today. Thank you so much for joining me. If you liked this, remember to do all the YouTube things of the liking and the subscribing and the stuffs. If you want to follow me on social media, I am at Vivian Asimos on Instagram, and I also occasionally post things on TikTok, but only really time lapses of me working. If you want to see something else on TikTok, let me know. I don't really know what to do because I'm this. But if you want to keep up on some of the other stuff, you can go ahead and follow me on Instagram, because that's mostly where I am active. You can go check out my blog, Incidental Mythology, which is all about pop culture as mythology, and you can check out my other channel, Incidental Mythology, where I do video essays about pop culture, kind of doing deep dives on certain elements of pop culture, focusing on storytelling and mythology. So that's it. As always, be good to one another and happy reading, and I will talk to you next time. Bye!